Hello everybody, it's me, Fee, White Zulu, and I want to welcome you to another chapter of, another chapter of Okavango Diary, and I hope you're enjoying these readings. I want to welcome you all, and if you are enjoying them, please share or press the like button or whatever people do if they want to. I'm sorry, I'm a bit Diomaka today. I haven't got any words in front of me to read, so I'm doing this off the cuff. However, this is a greeting to you all and a welcome, and I hope that you enjoy these chapters that I'm reading out. They go out twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays, if all goes well. And enjoy them, and thank you so much for listening to them. Share them around. Thank you and goodbye. This was my first full camp, and I spent the morning of Wednesday the 4th of July, getting ready for 16 guests. I had to try and make our pilot's accommodation, two very basic thatched huts for pilots' overnight stopovers when they needed to spend the night, look attractive. They were sparsely furnished with leftover bits and pieces, scrounged from the rest of the camp. I had been told that the guides were a couple, so I picked some bougainvillea flowers and did an arrangement for their bedside table. Cause and Sanyant arrived, all French-speaking, with hardly a word of English, including the two rather elderly and very towny guides, who looked rather disappointed at their accommodation. But since they get their trip for free and we were full, there was not much we could do. Fred and I were discussing letting them sleep in the treehouse, a wonderful hide built on a platform in a huge jackalberry tree overlooking the Kwai River, and where the owners of the camp stayed whenever they visited, and were just about to radio Maun to ask permission when Jonathan, who'd been sent to fetch the Berlusconi group from their plane, called in and asked for someone to translate to the Italians that he was only to collect 4 and not 6 people who had come in on 2 planes, 2 4-seater Cessnas. Marc was up to his eyebrows in French people in the gift shop, all trying on shirts and asking him questions at once. I can't speak Italian but can speak French, but don't know anything about the shop as it's a host domain. To buy time, I got Jane to beat the drum for lunch and clear the shop so that Marc could sort out the problem with the 6 guests stranded on the baking hot airstrip. It turned out that there were always 6 in the Berlusconi party, and our Maun office had put 2 of them into the Kwai River Lodge, another game lodge a few miles away. The mix-up was probably as a result of the language problem, as not one of these people could speak nor understand a word of English, and they now refused to be separated. We brought them all back to our lodge and gave them a bottle of wine to calm them down while we radioed Maun. There was no reply, as the office staff were out on their lunch hour. There was nothing we could do but now seat 18 guests at the table, plus Marc, as he could communicate with both parties, and one of the 2 guides. Our table can only accommodate 20 people, as that is our full capacity. So Fred and I ran around and made sure everybody had enough food and drink. Straight after lunch, we sent everyone to have a siesta in their rooms, and Marc and I drove 2 of the Italians to the treehouse. Now we realized that all of them could speak some French, so at least I could communicate with them as well. With the rooms sorted out, we had yet another problem. The French group had disliked the Italians on sight, and now refused to have them share the 2 Land Rovers for the afternoon game drive. Strictly speaking, we can comfortably seat 8 guests in each vehicle, as we had never had more than 16 at any time. But now we had 9 and 9. We have an old Toyota Hilux bakkie, with which we transport the African staff to and from their village when it's dark, in the early mornings and late at night because of lions. We offered this to the group of Italians, with Marc to drive and me to guide, because he was the only one who spoke their language, and I knew as much as the local guides about the game and the birds. But there was still another problem. Only Botswana registered guides may take visitors into the Moremi Game Reserve, which is one of the best in southern Africa for game viewing, and right on our doorstep. This ruled out Marc's and my group, who would only be able to see the game outside the reserve. This was turning into the apocryphal The Fox, the Goose, and the Cabbage story. Finally, we arranged that by juggling groups, guides, Marc and me, everyone could have a game drive in the reserve and one outside the reserve, which was perfectly well stocked with game, including the Big 5. All we had to do was try and seat 22 people at the table. The Botswana guides always ate dinner with us, so that the guests could interact with them and ask questions. An impossible task. So again, Fred and I decided we'd not sit with the guests, leave Marc to that, and I would help Jane with the waitressing, and Fred, because he can only speak English, would eat by himself at the bar. What a horrendous 2 days. I discovered that some continental people are no good at hiding their feelings, and the open contempt and hostility showed by the Swiss French towards the Italians was embarrassing. The so-called guide for the corps group now told us that they'd been promised to camp to themselves as a group of 16 by our Maun head office. Since he had practically no English, I can see how he might have misinterpreted everything. But also, having already had dealings with our office, anything's possible. At breakfast on the first morning, one of the Swiss school teachers was trying to photograph a black-eyed bulbul, which was perched on the breakfast table, when one of the Italian women who hadn't seen her walked between them just as the flash went off. The French woman went crazy, was performing and shouting, and when I told her that the bird would be back, said it was the last shot in the last film that she had, and now it was wasted. Fortunately, the Italians were just as thick-skinned as the Swiss, so a lot of the insults only bounced off and made us wince. A most tiring and uncomfortable 2 days. We survived, and finally on Friday, the 5th of July, the whole lot flew out, much to everybody's relief. Our next group was only 10, also corps enseignants, being the other half of the bunch we just got rid of flying in from Kilgana, our other camp. Luckily, this time, They did have the lodge to themselves. Their guide was called Anne Lawrence, a delightful and finally, thank God, English-speaking woman. When I met her, I thought she was English, but she said she was from Pretoria. Later on, and when they were all having a drink at the bar before dinner, I took a shot in the dark and asked her if she'd been at St. Anne's. It turned out that she had attended my old school, had left in 1960, 2 years before I got there, but had known my sister Nicolette. We had a lot of fun reminiscing about our old teachers and a few other horrors of the past. Anne did drama at Pietermaritzburg University and then went to live in France and became completely bilingual in French. She's now director of Sakapula Tours based in Pretoria. I asked her to phone you when she said she got home on Sunday, as I still don't know if any of my messages or any of the 3 letters I've sent you have reached you. Sadly, these got lost, so I've written this diary from memory up until here. Certainly, I've heard not a word written or relayed from a soul in South Africa. It is most frustrating not being able to talk directly to one's family, and Pauline being so busy doing all the personnel work as well as the supplies and figures for both camps is leaving personal stuff from camp staff to Babedi and Gladys, the 2 Botswana office girls who are less than efficient. Lions have been roaring incredibly loudly right up until 7 o'clock this morning. We had breakfast prepared at 9 o'clock as usual, all ready and waiting. When trying to keep the toast warm, wondered why no guests appeared. Eventually I sent one of the waitresses down to Rondavel number 1 to find out why they hadn't come out yet. She came back to tell me they were all refusing to open their doors, and the only black American who had come to Africa to see her roots woman was crying. I went rushing down, assuming there was some kind of crisis, only to find that the couple was so terrified by the lions roaring that they assumed they were just outside the room, and would pounce on them the minute they stepped outside. I reassured them and showed them with binoculars the 2 tawny heads with full manes, just visible in the long grass where they were lying about 100 yards away. You needn't worry about them. Their bellies are full now and they'll sleep for the next 22 hours, I told them. Slightly mollified, the guests crept out behind me and insisted I escort them to the dining table. I had to repeat this procedure with the occupants of the other 7 rondavels, as they were in the same condition, the women weeping and the men ashen-faced. I explained to them that the noise of a lion's roar can carry as far as 5 miles on a still night, and rattle your fillings if they roared from as close as they were right now. But they sounded as though they were on our doorstep, was the inevitable reply. I refrained from telling them that the lions had probably wandered across the paved front of their accommodation as they did with mine, the difference being that my hut was surrounded by raked sand, which gave away the telltale footprints of every creature that sniffed around my front door. We did this practice deliberately because we enjoyed knowing what animals came into the camp at night, whereas we'd rather the guests didn't know. Saturday, 7th of July. 7 of the core group wanted an early morning game drive, and a continental breakfast. The other 3 were not keen and wanted a cooked breakfast at 8. So we set our alarms for 5 a.m. and I'd organised the kitchen to bake some muffins the previous night. At 5:30 the following morning we had tea and coffee ready, sandwiches made and fresh muffins and biscuits out. And at 5:45, as arranged, we woke the guests. In the sitting area in the dark, Marc and I waited, and finally at about 6:30, the time they wanted to leave, the first sleepy guest arrived, complaining of the ungodly hour and the cold. We got them off for their game drive just as the other lot arrived for their breakfast. They were going to catch their plane at 8:30, and we had nobody coming until Sunday. So we sent the entire camp staff off for a well-deserved break, went to bed early ourselves. Sunday, 8th of July. This morning 2 new couples arrived. Joseph and Maggie, Israeli, although she was born in Pretoria. Very nice. He's a political lawyer, a very clever and well-read man who has an Arab mare which he rides regularly, and she is a travel agent. The other couple are young Americans, Tim and Barbara, also easy to please, and Tim just loves the food here. They went on their first game drive this afternoon, and Brown, the guide, took them to a dead elephant which we had heard about in the reserve, and in fact we could quite easily see the vultures circling as the carcass is not far from the lodge. Feeding on the carcass were several lions, and of course the usual hyenas, as well as jackals, both black-backed and side-striped or silver, which are quite rare. It looked just like a horrible grey stinking marquee, which the jackals, hyenas and vultures had hollowed out. Days passed quickly in this fashion. With guests coming and going out after a 3-day stay. I slipped into the routine very quickly and was pleased to find that the Botswana staff had taken a liking to me and given me a name. They called me Sisi, which is a pidgin version of the word sister. I helped them improve the standard of the food, which, under Fred's solo control, had slipped into rather tasteless and mushy offerings. Poor Fred had been managing for 2 weeks on his own, doing my job as well as his own, while the owners of the safari camps had prevaricated about replacing his wife, who normally did the job. She'd been flown out to Cape Town with heart problems, just as they had arrived to do a month's shift. I assumed that she'd be expected back quite quickly, but it turned out that she was really ill and not coming back at all. Fred was very wary when he heard them calling me Cece. Don't let them get too familiar with you, he warned. They'll begin taking advantage. They steal enough food from the kitchen anyway, and if you turn your back on them, they'll take an arm and a leg. I've grown up with Africans and knew where the boundaries lay between respect and familiarity. And I enjoyed seeing smiling faces when I opened up the laundry at 7 in the morning to hand out linen, soap and mosquito repellent. It was also nice to walk into the kitchen and find they were singing softly in a beautiful African harmony as they did the preparation work for lunch and supper. I had brought a little transistor radio cassette player with me, and I put it in the kitchen, tuned to one of their own music stations, and let it play very quietly so they could sing along to the music. One of the tapes I had brought with me was the Macarena, which had reached South Africa in 1994, but hadn't reached Botswana yet. So I also taught them the dance, much to their delight. I had chosen a quiet time just after lunch, when Fred had gone off to have his afternoon siesta. He, Marc and I, always tried to snatch 2 hours on our beds during the hottest time of the day, when all our guests were having a snooze. We worked from 7 a.m. until the last guest decided to go to bed, sometimes at 3 a.m. the following day, so it was a long old day for us. In the kitchen, I put the Macarena tape on, showed all the women the dance movements. They couldn't get enough of it, and when I was working in the office or at the dining room table, which had a wonderful view overlooking the waterhole, I often heard them humming the tune as they chopped vegetables. They told me that when they went back to their village, they taught everybody else there the dance as well. I often did little surprise raids on the guests' accommodation in between arrivals, just to check that the women were doing their jobs properly. I inspected the bathrooms for cleanliness and everything else, even down to making sure there was ice and filtered potable water in the thermos jugs provided. At the beginning of my sojourn there, I'd often found that the water hadn't been changed or the towels lined up properly. Little things like that. I would then call all the staff responsible and give them a pep talk. But the longer I worked there, the less often I found any slip-ups. The guests were given a questionnaire along with their bills as to the service and everything else that they had encountered. And although that we staff were not supposed to read them, of course we always did. I was delighted to find that while I was there wasn't a single complaint about the food or housekeeping side of the operation. The lodge was given 5 stars on all the areas under my control. And where there were comments, everybody said very complimentary things about the hospitality they had received. Fred, too, received very good reviews. And with Marc being the perfectionist he was, we made an excellent team. I enjoyed the 2 hours in the afternoon when the guests were all out on game drives, and we staff had the camp to ourselves. I spent that time in the office checking menus and making lists of fresh produce we needed to have flown in on a weekly basis and ordered by the 2-way radio we had with our Maun head office. I also typed my diary in between nipping into the kitchen to check on progress and also to issue the ingredients for the following meal. Kutsi, the chief cook, very young, slim Tswana woman, probably in her early 20s, could read and write, and she would make a list. Then the 2 of us would go into the locked storeroom, and I would hand her each item she called out to put in the basket. Then we did the same in the fridge and freezer rooms. I was given the number of guests we had to feed and did the multiplications to accommodate how much food we could cook and prepare. Then laid it down with our baskets. I explained how I wanted the food prepared, putting out various herbs and spices, which they hadn't been using previously. I'd been warned by Fred that if I left the storerooms unlocked and turned my attention to something else even for a minute, the staff would steal like magpies. Occasionally it happened, and I discovered somebody had pocketed a raw egg because they dropped it just outside the office for everyone to see. Fred and I grilled them all, but nobody owned up. Everything had to be put in those baskets, with me overseeing every item. Even the mayonnaise had to be handmade, and if we were having a salad or coleslaw, which required it, and which happened practically every lunch, as the weather was so hot, I had to count out the number of eggs, tablespoons of oil, vinegar, mustard, teaspoons of sugar and salt, individually into a bowl. I couldn't leave anything to chance. Because they seemed to like me so much, the staff never got me into trouble. I think they throttled back on their thieving while I was there, and I knew they stopped taking shortcuts when they prepared the rooms, as they didn't want to let me down. The other reason they prevented me from disappointment by taking shortcuts was that the permanent manageress was an absolute tyrant. She was a South African, Afrikaans-speaking woman with a volatile temper and treated the women staff very harshly. I learned this as we worked alongside each other, putting little garnishes and other finishing touches to the salad. She would yell at them and threaten them with utter disrespect. All the staff were so terrified of having me fired and their permanent boss back that they did their very best to please not just me, but the guests in general. Eventually, I was able to sit at my old computer and type my diary, knowing that everything was going smoothly in the kitchen. This is where having grown-ups with Africans helped me.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to my videos and my stories of my life. And I want to thank John Moslane for being what I call the sound engineer, but I'm sure there's a more professional word for it. However, faithful, and for 4 years now, I think, he has been here for me every Wednesday. Well, I think it's Wednesdays, but once a week to record 2 chapters of whichever book it is I'm reading. And without him, this couldn't be done. So a big thank you to John. Also, Sean van Vuren, we send the videos to him. Sorry, I'm not reading this. I'm just doing it off the cuff. And my brain is a bit Jumaka. And Sean uploads them to the YouTube channel where you can find them all in playlists. He does it beautifully. And I want to thank them both for all the help that they give me. Well, it's not help. They do everything for me. And it's a great asset. So also, I have a website called whitezulubook.com, obviously www in front of it, but you'll find it there. Quite easy to find. Johnny Clegg's called The White Zulu. Mine's called White Zulu. And you will find on my website, you'll find all kinds of photographs going way back to when my ancestors settled in the Cape, 1652. Well, not photographs of them, but descriptions. This photograph of my grandmother's wedding, and lovely, lovely photos of the farm we still own. My sister sent me a photograph this morning of the farm in midsummer, and she says how beautiful it's looking. I've had a lot of rain. So, just want to thank my helpers, John and Sean, to thank you all for listening, and also please share this with everybody else. Hit the like button and enjoy. Goodbye.